Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to this week's episode of the Legal Beagle podcast. This week, we are joined by Michael Kaplen from New York. Michael Kaplen is what I would call a brain expert. He's an attorney that has worked in the field of brains. I know that sounds strange, but you'll understand here in a second when Michael starts explaining things to you. He's worked with brains for almost the last 40 years at the firm of DeCaro Kaplen. Am I saying that right? DeCaro and Kaplen.
DeCaro and Kaplen.
DeCaro and Kaplen out of New York. Michael has taught at multiple schools, including being the only professor in the country to teach a TBI class at George Washington University. In a White House summit about concussions. He's a 14-time super lawyer. He's been recognized by U.S. News and World Report. He was heavily involved in the TBI cases that involved the NFL and the concussion cases. And he is an author, a lecturer, and what I call a brain expert. Welcome, Michael Kaplen.
Jonathan, thank you for inviting me to join you today.
It is great to have you. Let's start with a very basic question that I think all of our viewers or listeners would like to know. Michael, what is a brain injury?
Well, a brain injury can vary in many, many different respects, because one thing for certain about a brain injury is that no two brain injuries are the same. A brain injury can go from a catastrophic injury such as a concussion down to a catastrophic injury such as a coma, all the way down to an injury such as a concussion. But a concussion is a brain injury and can be as serious to the individual as a coma, because all brain injuries, whether they're classified as mild, moderate, or severe, have to be treated seriously, because each one of them can have lifetime consequences to the individual.
So we hear this term, or at least we use this term in our profession, TBI, which stands for traumatic brain injury. When people hear that term, let's say non-attorneys, is that the same as saying you have a concussion?
Well, a traumatic brain injury means that the injury to the brain damage was caused by trauma. And that trauma can produce a variety of different injuries. The trauma can take place as a result of a fall. It could take place as a result of an automobile accident. It could involve a construction site accident. It could involve an assault. It could be as a result of domestic violence. There are unlimited ways that the brain can be injured. But if it's injured as a result of some type of trauma, it's called a traumatic brain injury, as opposed to a brain injury or brain damage that results as a result of a birth injury or a stroke or an infection, which we would call an acquired brain injury.
So when you say the words traumatic brain injury, I know you just mentioned earlier they can be mild, moderate, or severe. Do people get confused with the term traumatic in that those three words, traumatic brain injury? Do you think that only means severe injury?
No, I think they get confused with the terms mild, moderate, or severe, because those terms really have no meaning to me as an attorney or the individual who sustains that brain injury. Because when people ask me what is a mild traumatic brain injury, my answer, if it's someone else's brain and not mine, because all brain injuries have to be taken seriously. So where do these terms come from, and why does it cause the public and attorneys so many problems? It comes from something known as the Glasgow Coma scale, which is used by EMS personnel and emergency department personnel for a quick, rapid assessment of an individual's neurological condition before they arrive at the emergency room or after they arrive at the emergency room or emergency department, to determine what kind of quick, acute care is needed for that individual. And it's really a test of brain function, respiration, whether or not your eyes are open, whether or not you're awake or asleep. And it's graded on a scale of 3, not 0, but 3. When you're dead, you still get a 3, up to the score of 15. And it's divided into several parts. One, can you open your eyes? Are you responsive to commands? Things, can you breathe without assistance? And each one of these areas is scored. If you are very catastrophically injured, you will be classified as a severe brain injury, which would be something like from 3 to 5 or 3 to 7. And then there's a mild category, and there's a category called moderate brain injury, and then there's a category called mild brain injury. Now, most people who sustain a brain injury or concussion, and I use those terms synonymously, will be scored as a mild brain injury. And unfortunately, that term is going to be carried with them for the rest of their medical care, as well as, unfortunately, in any legal proceeding that's going to take place. And that term becomes attached to them and is really a misnomer, because it doesn't talk about the consequences of brain injury. As a brain injury attorney, that's what I'm concerned about, the consequences of brain injury. And those consequences can range in many different areas. They could be cognitive consequences, memory problems, concentration problems, the ability to multitask, do more than one thing at the same time. They could be physical problems, nausea, vomiting, headaches, sensitivity to bright light, sensitivity to sound, vestibular problems, dizziness. These all plague in people who have sustained even a mild traumatic brain injury or concussion. There could be emotional or behavioral consequences to a brain injury as well. The person can have something known as disinhibition, acting inappropriately, saying the most inappropriate things because there is no break in that person. We could be talking right now and you could be thinking something about me. I hope not, but you wouldn't say it because there's a break in your mind. A person who has a brain injury might lose that break and say inappropriate things or act inappropriately. They might suffer from depression, anxiety, even things like bipolar disorder are consequences of traumatic brain injuries. And these are all the different consequences that can happen to an individual, whether or not that brain injury is classified as mild, moderate, or severe.
Take me back to that Glasgow Coma score. I think that this score sometimes can be misleading for people. And what I mean by that, and I'm sure you've experienced this over your career, oftentimes someone may score a 15, and that doesn't mean they didn't have a brain injury, correct?
That's absolutely true. It just means that when they reach the emergency room of the hospital, maybe they don't need to have a CAT scan. Maybe they don't need to be evaluated by a neurosurgeon. Maybe they don't need to stay overnight for evaluation. But it doesn't mean that they didn't sustain some type of brain injury with resulting brain damage.
I think that's a misconception that maybe exists in our profession. And what I mean by that is I know other attorneys, and I've dealt with it myself, where you see that 15 out of 15, the defense attorney will highlight that saying, look, there was no indication early on that there was any issues with the brain. And other attorneys will miss that on cases because they'll look themselves and say, look, it says 15 out of 15. So would you agree that the GCS score is not dispositive as it relates to a brain injury?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that's one of our big problems in brain injury litigation, is brain injury attorneys dealing with that problem and misconceptions by defense attorneys, by insurance companies, juries, and even judges. But it's something that we can overcome. There's a lot of medical literature supporting what I'm saying. The Centers for Disease Control supports what I'm saying, and it is accurate and truthful. There is nothing mild about a mild traumatic brain injury.
People often call brain injuries the invisible injury, and I think that's because it's not apparent on its face. And I saw this video on your website, and I'm actually gonna post this link for people. It is, Michael, I'll be honest, it is probably the most comprehensive 5-minute video on brain injuries that I've ever seen, because it slowly explains to the viewer what a brain injury could be and what it might feel like to the person who is injured. Meaning, I think that's sometimes hard for people that are injured to even explain that cloud. What made you guys create that video? It is really, really strong. It's powerful. What made you guys put that together?
Well, thank you. We created this video out of frustration in working for many, many years with our clients that we call brain injury survivors, and their frustrations in dealing with members of the public and even members of their family or close friends with their brain injury. The problem is this is an invisible injury. You can't see it. So the person looks fine. They might sound fine. They might act fine to the casual observer. But there are hidden problems that that individual has that can't be seen by the naked eye. Unfortunately, through experience, through media, we have all been indoctrinated that you could look at a person and determine the extent of their injury. What are we looking for? We're looking for a cane. We're looking for a wheelchair. We're looking for some kind of disfigurement that that person has. And from there, we extrapolate that that person is having a problem. But a brain injured person doesn't walk with a limp, doesn't need a wheelchair or a cane, really needs a brain that is working properly. And that's something that we can't see. So when that individual is making complaints or acting in a peculiar or an unusual way, it is very difficult for anybody to understand what is happening to that person. If that person is sitting at the Thanksgiving table and says, I need to take a break, I just, there's too much sound, there's too much confusion going on. People are talking all around me, and I just can't keep up with it. And I'm just fatigued as a result of this. I need to put my head down and rest. They've run out, their battery, their brain has run out of energy much sooner than your brain or my brain would. And the reaction by other people is sometimes, unfortunately, cruel. Sometimes it's just a lack of understanding. Sometimes they're told that they're faking it or making it up or just get over it. But these individuals are having real problems in their lives, and they are not getting the respect that they deserve. We created this video so that the public can understand what is happening to an individual with a brain injury and appreciate this invisible injury.
At the end of the video, you guys do something that I thought was absolutely fantastic. And I just want to ask the thought process behind this. There's a positive ending to this video. It is not all doom and gloom. And I'm not ruining it for anyone because you have to watch it. Like, there's no words I can use to put it in or to do it justice. You have to just go watch this as a viewer. But at the end, you guys spend some time, and it really does end on a positive note. Why was it important to do that in this video and kind of end the video with some positivity, as opposed to, look, this is what people are experiencing. This is how difficult it can be. That's what's going to happen for the rest of their life. You really didn't end it that way.
Because we represent persons with a brain injury, not a brain injured person. And a person with a brain injury has a life. That life might have some difficulties attached to it, but it is a life worth saving and worth respecting. And with proper care, proper treatment, proper respect, there is a good chance that the individual, the brain injury survivor, can live some type of a good, productive life.
I'm going to ask this next question from two different angles. So hopefully you can answer it that way. From the first angle, as a person who is injured with a brain injury, if you're having trouble articulating that injury or what you're feeling, and again, I would encourage that person to watch your video because it may help them quickly identify some of the things they're probably dealing with. But outside of that, how would you advise someone who's had a brain injury to make others aware of these problems that are occurring now that were not there prior to the accident?
Well, one thing is to show them that video or other videos on our website to provide them with information. They might ask other people to go to the Centers for Disease Control's website. It has some very terrific information about traumatic brain injury and how it affects a person. And really ask the individual who has this brain injury to be patient to some extent and understanding with individuals who can't appreciate what they are going through. It's difficult and unfortunately very frustrating for the brain injury survivor to deal with because they are not treated with respect and the dignity that they're entitled to.
I love the fact that you just called them a survivor and not a victim. I think that's a very important distinction. I really appreciate that you said that they are survivors, not victims. I think sometimes that label can be misused and does not have any encouragement to it when you say victim. So I like that. The second part of that question, for an attorney that is dealing with a client that may have a brain injury but has not yet heard from the client any of these symptoms, what should they be looking for? What should they be concerned with to identify if this is legitimately an injury in the case?
Well, first, let's talk about the fact that brain injuries are often missed by the medical system themselves, mild brain injuries or concussions. They're misdiagnosed in the emergency department. People leave after sustaining a head trauma, leave with symptoms of headaches, nausea, vomiting, memory problems, confusion, and are never properly diagnosed as having a brain injury. And because of that, unfortunately, they don't get proper treatment. But they had an accident. They might have sustained some other injury. They might have been told by a loved one that you're just not acting properly, and maybe a wife or a husband has read an article in a popular magazine about brain injury and say, look, this is you. This is what happened to you. You need some help. And sometimes individuals will come to my office with no diagnosis of a brain injury, but knowing that something is wrong and needing legal representation for the accident that they sustained. And sometimes it's the attorney who picks up that brain injury in the first instance that has been missed. A good example might be of that. Let's take an elderly individual who fell and had a fractured hip. An individual who was living independently by themselves, able to care for their needs, shop, go out, live a productive life. Now they had a fractured hip. That fractured hip has been treated in the hospital. Perhaps they got a new hip and they're discharged home. And now they no longer can function anymore the way they were functioning. Can they walk the same? Yes, maybe even better than before they fell. They got a new hip. But now they can't live alone. They can't tend for their own needs. They can't shop. They act peculiar. They forget things. Are they suffering from dementia? No, that's not dementia all of a sudden. That's the result of a brain injury that never was diagnosed in the hospital. Now, when they come to me as an attorney because they want to sue the store for creating a wet floor or leaving a product on the floor that caused them to slip and fall, they come to me talking about their fractured hip.
Right.
And we start talking, and I talk to them, and I talk maybe to members of their family, and I learn about them. And I realize that the fractured hip is just a small part of what happened to them and their damages. So my point is, you need to listen to your client, and you need to go visit them in their home, and you need to speak to their spouse or their children or their friends or their employer or their co-employees to find out some information about that individual and how they're acting, how they were before this incident, how they are now, to put together the full story to determine whether or not they have a brain injury. Because frequently people with a brain injury don't even realize themselves that there's a problem. It's other people who realize that there is a problem. And there is nothing wrong with an attorney diagnosing initially that that individual needs to go to see a brain injury specialist for help.
I don't think I'm going out on a limb when I say that I think brain injuries scare a lot of attorneys, some very capable and very smart attorneys. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that attorneys are afraid to pursue these cases or pursue the full extent of damages related to a brain injury?
Because, like everybody else, they can't see these injuries. They're invisible, and they can't appreciate or understand them. And these cases are complicated cases. It's not a simple injury like a fractured arm that's going to heal. A brain injury can last a lifetime and has consequences that change over time. So it involves a lot of care on the part of the attorney, and it involves a lot of work with the individual who has sustained that brain injury. Sometimes my clients are not easy to deal with, but they're not that way because they intend to create problems for me or because they're not nice people. They're that way because they have a brain injury. And I have to understand that, and my staff has to understand that in working with my clients. I can't put them on hold and have music going for 10 minutes on the telephone. That doesn't work. It's going to drive them crazy. I have to understand that they might call me back several times after I've told them something. Why? Because they just don't remember what I told them, because they have memory problems. They might be angry at times or upset or even overly emotional. And that sometimes, unfortunately, turns attorneys off. So not every brain injury case or person who has sustained a brain injury is right for every attorney. You have to have a lot of patience and understanding in order to represent a survivor of a brain injury. So when I lecture to attorneys about brain injury, that's what I tell them. This is not right for everybody. If you're running a practice that's running on a clock with hundreds and hundreds of cases, perhaps it's time that you take a person who sustained a brain injury and comes to see you and refer them to somebody with the understanding and patience who could really assist that individual. And I also importantly tell individuals that if they're not getting the respect that they deserve from their attorney, and the attorney is poo-pooing their problems and looking them and telling them to get over it, or this is mild and doesn't make any sense, that it's time to change attorneys. And an individual always has a right to change attorneys, and they always have a right to demand that they be treated with respect.
I really like that because I think it echoes two different sentiments. One is know your capabilities as an attorney, and don't be afraid of telling a client that you don't think you're capable of handling this type of injury claim. That it's okay to do that. I think sometimes attorneys play the hero card a little too much, and to the detriment of clients. I'm sure, as you've just discussed that, Michael, you've seen that over your career. But the second thing is, I love the idea of patience. I have a dear friend who practices injury law out of San Diego, California, and she had a client. It's very funny that you bring this up. That every week she has to have the same conversation with the client, the exact same conversation, and she said it takes an extreme amount of patience to deal with a brain injury, because it's not that the client is being needy or is unintelligent or simply doesn't comprehend what she's trying to explain. It's they don't remember after the call that they went through all of what's going on in the case, and she's got to now explain it again. And she said over the representation of that client, it took a lot of patience, not only from her but from her staff, to appreciate that individual client's needs, because, as you said, it's not necessarily going to be easy to represent someone with a brain injury. Michael, I want you to try to dispel a couple of myths that I think exist with brain injuries. First one, you have to lose consciousness to suffer a brain injury.
That's not true. That's a myth. You don't need to lose consciousness in order to suffer a brain injury. The definition of a brain injury or a concussion or a mild traumatic brain injury does not include the necessity of loss of consciousness. Being dazed or confused is sufficient in order to diagnose a concussion. In fact, you can't ask someone, "Did you lose consciousness?" because how would they ever know that they lost consciousness? So it starts off in a silly way when somebody says, "Oh, did you lose consciousness?" No. Okay. Boom. No, you didn't have a brain injury. Well, it just doesn't make sense. But the World Health Organization, the American Academy of Neurology, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Centers for Disease Control, all agree you do not need to lose consciousness in order to sustain the concussion. Period.
Okay. Myth number two, you've had multiple testing done. You've had an MRI, a CT, and an EEG, and they've all come back negative, so you don't have a brain injury. True or false?
Well, that's false. Why? Because these tests are not sensitive enough to determine whether or not you had a brain injury. In fact, people don't realize that an MRI or a CT scan can't even tell the radiologist whether you're alive or dead. And the microscopic changes that happen in the brain as a result of a brain injury can't be picked up on these tests. They're just not sensitive today. The sensitivity to technology isn't there in order to pick up these injuries, these microscopic changes to the neurons in the brain, tearing, stretching, bruising of that brain can't be picked up on these tests.
Myth number three, you have to actually strike your head to have a brain injury.
That's a myth. That's a big myth, because the brain can be injured just from moving forwards or backwards within the skull. The skull might provide you some good protection from some hitting your head like a baseball bat, but the inside of the skull itself is very rough with a lot of protrusions and sharp edges. And the brain is floating within that skull in what's known as cerebral spinal fluid. The brain is very soft, like jello. And when there is trauma caused by the head moving forwards and backwards, that brain is going backwards and forwards within the skull, and it's striking the inside areas, the interior of the skull, and is damaged. So you do not need to strike your head against anything in order to sustain a traumatic brain injury.
Michael, it can certainly be argued that you have dedicated your career to brain injuries. What are some pro tips outside of what you've already offered for people that really do want to help those survivors of brain injuries and want to pursue these cases, but maybe don't have a familiarity with these types of cases? What are some pro tips that you would give that attorney that may be interested in really wanting to learn this, wanting to understand it, wanting to help people, but maybe isn't experienced enough to deal with these types of injuries?
Well, the first tip I would give them is to learn about what a brain injury is, in order to understand it, in order to recognize it, in order to present proper evidence in a courtroom about it. You have to understand the brain and how that brain is injured. There are courses given for attorneys in this area, to provide lectures at bar associations to assist attorneys. But it would also be important for the attorney to join their local state brain injury association and go to their meetings to understand and meet individuals who have had a brain injury, to understand that individual and what life is like after they have sustained a brain injury. Because it's very difficult for anybody who hasn't sustained a brain injury to appreciate what happens to the individual with a brain injury. Next, as we talked about, you need a lot of patience and a lot of understanding in order to represent a person with a brain injury, and understand that a brain injury case is like no other case in terms of the amount of time that you as an attorney will put into it, and the amount of funds that are necessary in order to properly prosecute a brain injury case, because of all the various type of experts that are necessary to present in a court of law, to understand both the injury and the full extent of that individual's damages.
Speaking of experts, there are a couple of tests that have emerged as better indicators of brain injuries. One's a functional MRI, the other is a PET scan. Can you talk to me about those tests, maybe in more generality, what those tests are identifying and why they've been more relied on as a good indicator?
Sure. Because those tests are tests of how the brain functions rather than the structure of the brain. We talked about MRIs or CAT scans not being able to diagnose the brain injury because they can't see it. But these tests are not tests, or these studies are not studies of the structure of the brain. They are studies of how the brain is functioning. And because it is not looking at the structure but the functioning of the brain, these tests are useful in determining that the problems that the individual has and what area of the brain these problems emanate from.
How do we better protect the brain so that these injuries don't continue to occur? That's I know maybe a tough question, but how, in your opinion, how do we better protect the brain so that we don't continue to see brain injury cases?
Well, the best cure for a brain injury is prevention. So we have to prevent these brain injuries from happening by care. I mean, what is a negligence action? What is it that you and I do? We're bringing a lawsuit for someone, whatever the injury is, because someone didn't exercise reasonable care and caution in what they were doing that caused someone else to be injured. And a brain injury in that respect is no different than any other injury. So we need to hold everybody to this standard of care, to prevent these injuries from occurring. But at the same time, we need to be careful ourselves as parents and make sure that our children wear helmets when they're riding a bicycle, that they wear seatbelts in a car, that if you have a little child, that you protect the home in a way that they're not going to fall down a flight of steps, that when you're working with an elderly individual who's a family member, you make sure that you eliminate tripping hazards around that house to prevent them from falling and striking their head on an object. As I said, we can't fix the brain, unfortunately, many times after it's been injured, but we sure can go a long way in preventing these injuries from happening.
Michael, I have one final question for you. It is safe to say that you have dedicated your life to these types of injuries, these brain injuries. You've taught, you continue to teach, you've lectured, you've mentored other attorneys. If there was a few sentences to describe how you want to be remembered in this profession, once you pass the baton, once you retire, once you step away from representing people, what would those few sentences be? How would you like to be remembered in this profession for the work that you've done?
I never thought about that. That's a good question. I'd like to be remembered in a way that I have provided some degree of dignity and hope and understanding to brain injury survivors. And as my work as an attorney, I provided them with a better day and a better future.
Wonderfully said. Michael Kaplen, thank you so much for joining us on this week's podcast. I will post a link to Michael's website as well as to that video, The Invisible Injury, that we talked about. I encourage everyone to watch that. That video is really, really well done. I can't overstate that enough. And if you have any questions, you'll have all of Michael's contact information on this week's podcast. Thank you, Michael.
Jonathan, thank you very much. I enjoyed working with you today.